Thanks. I'm the only one playing at home here, so it's a pleasure to have all of you in the new building, the Football Performance Center. So make sure you have a look around, interact with people, and see what we do here. I've been given this task today to talk about training load monitoring in athletics, what's possible, where are the gaps, and you will see by the end of the talk that there is a lot of gaps, really, a lot of things that are still possible research-wise to help understand more about this phenomenon. No conflict of interest to report, and I'll move on to the outline. So I will talk about training load monitoring with highlighting what the main concepts are, so we understand the area a little bit better, a little bit about the state of the art, what we currently know, what we don't know, what's the knowledge, and I'll make sure you leave this room understanding that athletics is not one sport, and we shouldn't treat athletics as one sport when we talk about training monitoring and injury risks. Gaps and opportunities, where are they and what we can do, and ideally a way forward. And I quite like the idea of Andrea Mosler before, saying that we should probably do something together collectively as a community, and nowadays there is a possibility to do so. So first of all, there is an increased interest in training load monitoring. If you just look at PubMed data and you use training load monitoring as a keyword, you can see the number of publications has been exponentially increasing, which means there is a lot of interest in it. It's also probably easier to start to measure a number of things, but the worrying thing is also that it's becoming a bit of an industry, so there is a lot of things that can be solved for training monitoring as a product around the world. And also what we know in athletics is that there is clear evidence that it's important to measure training load. It's important to understand what happens in training, and it's important to understand what technology is available and what we can possibly do to understand more about training load. But before we talk about training load, we should talk about history. Everybody that comes to my lectures knows I like history and I like to go back. So before we measure something in a sport, we need to understand where the training prescription culture comes from. Otherwise, we are not able to understand why things happen. So if we look at history, we should know that athletics is one of the most ancient sports. It was developed since ancient Greece. We had professional coaches, professional athletes by then. Olympic Games were invented there. What do we know? That the trainers experimented with various fads, including cheese-heavy and meat-heavy diet. So things haven't really changed, have they, since those times. Epictetus said that if you want to win at the Olympics, you have to follow the rules and you don't eat dessert, which is what nutritionists say these days. We know that if you want to be a pentathlete, you have to have certain anthropometric structures, and you should do certain things in training to make sure you can bend and limber for backwards bending of the throwing of the javelin. So good strength and conditioning advice. And finally, that the trainers used the tetrad, which was a 4-day regimen involving a combination of a day of preparation, a day of all-out effort, a day of relaxation, and a day of moderate exercise. So I'm not sure how much we've actually contributed to understanding how we should train athletes with sports science and medicine. The Greeks had a pretty good idea already. We are just refining the structure. Then came the Russian methodology, and now the internet gurus. So athletics training prescriptions are the result of a long culture in the sport, and they've been influenced a lot, especially in the modern world, by the work coming from Russia about periodization. So, for example, Matveyev, Vladimir Zasyovsky, or Anatoly Bondarchuk, as far as throwing goes. And then now there has been evolution from other parts of the world, people that tell how coaches should train or prescribe training programs. So we need to understand where this is coming from. So a few operational definitions. We will talk about load, and this is the definition accepted by the IOC consensus statement. So it's a combination of things that are applied to a human biological system to produce adaptation. And we define as internal load the biological, both physiological and psychological stressors that are imposed on the athlete. And then the external load are objective measures of work performed by the athlete during training or competition. So general concept, something internal, something external, without going into too many details, but this is what we will talk about. So why we need to know about training load? First of all, we need to recognize that the coach knows what is needed to succeed. That's why they are coaching and we are doing the science. Otherwise, we will do the other way around. So the coaches coach, they know what they're doing, they know what is needed to succeed, or they should know. But we need to help them to stay on path, because the difference between failure and success is very tiny, especially when you work with elite athletes. So our job is to quantify training loads, measure, understand things, and help them, support them to stay on the right path. But we need to quantify what the athlete is actually doing and not what is prescribed. So we've seen before there is a big mismatch between what is actually prescribed and what the athlete does, and is very acute, especially in this world where there is a lot of athletes that are coached remotely. So the coach is in another part in the world, the athlete receives the program, goes out, does something, and there is always a bit of a mismatch. But also what a coach might plan at the beginning of the season or at the beginning of a session might differ from what actually happens in session. So having this information already per se helps prescribing better training. Because if the coach is prescribing a certain amount of training and the athlete completes only less than 80%, we've seen before what happens. There is a high risk of injury, or the other way around. I think this is one of the most important things to realize. This is Grigory Rodchenkov. He declared he was the one that blew up the whole systematic doping story in Russia. And he said that doping begins when harm from their heavy training workload becomes more dangerous than harm from using doping. So this is why it's important to measure training load, because unfortunately history might tell us, and has told us already, that many athletes couldn't cope with the training load that was given to them, and therefore they look for avenues to survive. The other thing we should keep in mind is that we always need to be very critical of, and coaches should be, of applying training paradigms that have been done by champions or groups of athletes that then later on are found to be involved with using illegal drugs, because clearly they are not possible in populations that are not making use of drugs. So always be critical is the key. So what can we use to measure? These are just few of the measurements. So if we want to measure internal load, these are the kind of things that can be used to measure internal load. And if we want to use external load, there is a plethora of other things that we can do. And with the increase in wearable technology, we will be able to do more and more and more measurements when athletes train that doesn't affect what they actually do normally. So it can be seamless. They can perform and we can measure them. But why is training load monitoring is important? I am not a clinician, so I am going to tell the story of why training load is important for performance. So everybody is a bit obsessed about predicting injury, and you shouldn't want any injury. So you shouldn't be worried about predicting injury. You should be worried about winning a medal if you are in the performance world like I am. But it's important to know that if you do too much training, then you can run into the risk of injury. So injury, then fatigue over training, of course. You want to make sure that the amount of training is appropriate to improve performance and the athlete doesn't run into fatigue. And in many athletics events, in particular middle and long distance, big risk of illness if excessive training loads are there. But the key thing is that monitoring training and understanding what training does to an athlete is actually a mean to enhance performance. So if you change that mindset and you work with the coach to enhance performance, then the injury, fatigue, and illness becomes a non-issue, because if you're enhancing performance, you're doing things right, you don't run into these issues, theoretically. What coaches do is this, we know very well, so this is the base level of capacity or well-being or performance. They apply a load, which is a single session or a series of sessions, and by continually applying that, they try to make the athlete better. We know very well that if this load is inappropriate, too frequent, too big, cannot be sustained by the athlete, what happens is there is a reduced ability to accept load and an increased susceptibility to injury. So we know that things go south if the load is too much, and things can go north if the load is appropriate. So what do we know about training load in athletics? We have a number of epidemiological studies that have shown a high prevalence of injury. I would say I'm not surprised, because what we try to do when we coach somebody in athletics is we are trying to push them to the limit of their abilities, because what they aim for is their PB. And their PB is the best thing they can ever do. And sometimes they reach it and they never improve for another 4 or 5 years. So we're pushing them to their human limit, which is completely different to what you would do to a footballer or a volleyball player. We also know that the risk factors seem to be connected to training overload. You train too much, you get ill, or you get injured. But there is no study actually reporting load. So this is the biggest thing. We talk about load, there is no study reporting load. And there are very few peer-reviewed studies reporting training loads of elite or youth athletic cohorts in a very systematic, longitudinal way. And I'll analyze that. And there is a lack of published peer-reviewed work on some disciplines within athletics. So understanding training load prescriptions better can help improve performance, because providing that information to the coaching staff, then they can design better training plans. So athletics is not one sport. What these guys do is different from these guys do. So they are runners, sprinters, marathon runners, middle distance. What these guys do is different from what these guys do and these guys. High jumpers, lots of vertical type of activities. Long jumpers, lots of horizontal jumps. Throwers, hammer throwers, discus throwers, shot putters, completely different from multi-eventers. So we should look at athletics not as one sport, but be discipline specific, or at least within events. So what the throwers do training-wise is completely different from the middle distance runners. So we need to understand training load in those contexts. What are the typical training volumes? If you read Paula Radcliffe's book, she was training 200 more kilometers per week, which is a lot of running. The training did not differ during the winter a great deal, was similar all year round. Main session was in the morning. She ran 4 hard sessions per week, and she used to do a tempo run at gold marathon pace for over an hour. Try that, okay? Would you copy that to someone else? Maybe it's not appropriate. These are reported training loads for throwers, hammer thrower. 3,770 throws with different implements of hammer, throwing different implements of auxiliary equipment, weight training exercises, about 650 tons, imitation exercises, some running, some jumping. So the content, the training content is completely different. They're doing athletics, is a different world, okay? So let's accept that and move on. But we don't have a lot of studies that show that. These are reported training loads from athletes or coaches on books, on coaching magazines. There isn't really a lot of information peer-reviewed. What we have peer-reviewed is that a lot of epidemiological studies that have used training time to quantify load. So there is a fantastic PhD from Jenny Jacobson and all the papers published that has shown that if you increase training time, you run into more risks of injury. But all the studies that have shown epidemiological information about athletics and injury have not actually reported the training load. And I can show you that time is only one piece of the puzzle. So can we really understand training load from duration? What athletes do during that time is absolutely relevant. Athletes can train for a similar duration, but the content is completely different. Most athletes perform strength training as well, and I am not aware of any study that has longitudinally followed, for example, throwers, and has reported the training load in the gym. And the intensity of track-based activities is also rarely reported. So this is an example of some of the data collection we do routinely. These are athletes that are in the same group. So their training time, they turn up to training at the same time and they leave the facility at the same time. But what they do within their train time is different. So some do more, some do less, and this is the breakdown of the activities they do just running outside. So treadmill, tempo runs, strides. So that's the level of detail that we now collect on our athletes to understand what happens. So the consequence of duration is a lot of studies have been reporting the use of session RPE in different sports and have suggested that session RPE can be a good way to measure training load. Yes, it is. It's a measure of internal training load, but not alone. the assumption is honesty of assessment. So when you ask your athlete, how hard was it? And they say 10, you're assuming that they are telling you the truth. And I think elite athletes with a lot of experience and a lot of experience with the measurement can tell you the truth. The same might not be true for some cohorts. But internal load is only one element of the training load equation. You need to know what actually happens in the session so you can put this information into context. And what do you change if you have a high session RPE? So an athlete reports a high session RPE, what do you change? You change the volume, the intensity, the duration. And I'll make my case with this data. So these are young athletes, they do different sport, they train more or less for the same number of minutes. So session RPE is multiplying the time in minutes times the RPE. All these boys had the same RPE. So there's a squash player, table tennis player, a sprinter, and an endurance runner. The time is pretty similar. The session RPE, when you multiply, is pretty similar. There's about 100 arbitrary units of difference. But what actually happened in training? The boy with the lowest session RPE was running for 8K, did 334 forms of acceleration, and that's the session RPE. The squash player was doing 4,820 meters and did 2,000 accelerations. Table tennis player did this, and the sprinter did that. So the content is completely different. So just having the session RPE can't inform what you're going to do training-wise unless you know the details. And also, can we really trust self-reports? Fantastic paper, this one. If you get the chance, read it. But also, athletes that are very expert, they don't report their intensity of training very, very well. So always a word of caution when you're using reported or self-reported measures. The other issue is that if we cannot rely on session RPE and cannot rely only on time, usually track and field coaches are very good at prescribing the sessions. So they say, okay, today I'm going to do 3 times 200 meters, 15 minutes rest, 2 times 200 meters, 2 minutes rest in between. So if we use this information, the athlete should run about 1,000 meters, right? So that's what we do. If we put that into a database, this is what we calculate as a total volume. I work with coaches here, so this is what happens. This is the session. I go and measure the session, and the athlete wears an IMU. So this is Coach Brendan Tammo a few years ago. And when you record the session, this is actually what happens. So the session is about 1 hour and 39 minutes, more or less. So the athlete comes and does a warm-up, that's the speed, does a series of strides or accelerations, then does a few other bits and bobs, then he does a dynamic warm-up, then he does 3 times 200, 1, 2, 3, blood lactate is collected here and here, then rests, blood lactate is collected before he goes again, 2 times 200, blood lactate here, blood lactate there. So the total distance of the session was actually 6.27, 6,000 meters, not 1,000. And for 50 minutes, he's warming up and he's doing a lot of stuff. So that's the detail. If you were just relying on that information, which is the key of the session, you wouldn't have that. And for the ones that are really passionate about session RPE, I did ask, and this was the answer. I think it was a 10. So details put the internal load into context. Only one doesn't help you. So this information is very useful for the coach, because what he does is he looks into the warm-up. Do I really need to do all this stuff? Maybe not. Can optimize that, but also you have the details of looking at what you can do recovery-wise or what you need to change into that session if necessary. The other things we try is activity monitors. So if the athletes wear activity monitors to look at sleep patterns and activity patterns, if you measure an endurance runner during the session, this is how an activity looks like. A thrower, this is how it looks like. A sprinter, hurdler, and a jumper. It's a completely different activity. So let's not cluster athletics into one box. Let's separate the boxes to make sure we are looking at the right things. We try to do this. So this is a study done in the UK before I came here. And we had national level runners. We followed them for 1 year and we measured every single training session, and we brought them back into the lab and on the field to do testing 5 times. And you can see that, of course, marathon runners cover more distance training than the 800-meter runners. This is how the training is built. Most of these athletes were not doing a lot of work between the lactate threshold and onset of blood lactate accumulation, and very limited amount of work over lactate threshold. So this is the information that you can have on real athletes. And we also measured performance, and we found out that a lot of assessments done in field, like the clinical speed, can be used also to predict performance. So if you have a good information about training load and you use tracking activities periodically, you can actually start predicting performance in some of the events. But this is one of the few studies that you can see that has actually reported 1 year longitudinal assessment of the athletes, and was Andy Galbraith's PhD. This is what we do here, and this is what we are trying to publish again. Month by month, this is the endurance team. First block of training, second block of training. The intensity of training is reported. The accumulated mileage is reported, but also what they do in the gym, because it's important. Athletes nowadays go in the gym and do strength training, and then they do activities on the track. So having a better understanding of what happens helps guiding training, but also when catastrophe occurs, which is injury, is the only way to go back and reflect on why that happened. So my advice is always this. Research provides you the evidence for some interventions. Then the coach brings his expertise. The most important thing you should do as a sports scientist is to measure what happens there and help the coach, because that can really guide the process. In jumping events, there is virtually no study I'm aware of longitudinal observations of jumpers. There are some diaries, no longitudinal peer reviewed, but there is some promising technology, and this is work that was done here. Volleyball players, there are some devices that can measure or count jumps, but counting is one thing, and understanding what type of jump is actually happening is a different thing. We've seen from the talk before how important it is tendon loading, and it's a completely different ballpark if you're jumping, rebounding, or running, or sprinting. I know Dr. Phil Graham-Smith will cover some of these things, but technology is coming. We might be able to do more in jumping events. In throwing events is the same. There is an instrumented sleeve now, so maybe useful for javelin throwers. There are few radar systems where you can measure spherical implements that get thrown. But again, there is a lack of studies on what actually happens training load-wise. And the throwers' training sessions are very peculiar. These are large people that don't move much, but they throw a lot of objects of different weight, of different mass, of different length, and they do a lot of rotational movements. So understanding that is absolutely crucial. So if we want to summarize what we know in terms of training load in athletics, there's a lot of stuff on endurance, and this is what technology is available to quantify external load. There isn't much on sprint at hurdles, there isn't much here, there isn't much here, there isn't much there. So for anybody interested in research, there's plenty of work that needs to be done. And again, because the number of athletes is very small, it's important that groups work together to really increase the number size. And also, if you are in the game of injury prediction, you need a lot of injuries before you can build a predictive model. And if you have a small group of 4 athletes with 2 injuries per year, you're never going to be able to predict anything. That's our experience here as well. What training monitoring options do you have? We wrote this review for the conference here a couple of years ago. There are cardiorespiratory parameters that can be measured quite accurately with low cost and high practicality. Very few humoral parameters like venous blood, capillary blood, sweat, saliva. They tend to be very expensive, not incredibly practical. They don't give a lot of answers very, very quickly, and you need a long investment in time and money to be able to do something meaningful. And neuromuscular and muscle metabolism parameters is a bit of a mixed bag. So you need to be realistic of what you can put in place and what you can do. So how I work with coaches is this. The first thing I do is I develop what I call the library. What is the library? So every coach in every sport, in every event, has a number of sessions that they use with their athletes. And if you measure and quantify those sessions, then you open the dialogue, because it's the work of the coach, and then you can go to the coach and say, this is what you've done today. this is what is done to this athlete. Is this what you tried to do or not? Is this the object of your session or not? And this is an example. So going with athletes, the coach is prescribing training, I am measuring things, and I build a system whereby everything is coded, and you can go into an individual athlete, click the particular session and the session name, and sees what happened in that particular session. So this is a group of middle distance runners. So what was the peak velocity? How much time they spend in zone 5, which is what the coaches want to see. What's the distance they covered? What's the relative load per minute? What's the total load per minute? And what's the average velocity they reached in that session? So the coach can look at it and say, okay, this is what I wanted to do, but also compare with another person. So when I do the same session with this person, when I do fartlek here with this guy and fartlek with this guy runs more, he spends more time at 95% of heart rate. So what do I need to change? Do I change the session of this guy, or is this guy doing too much and I change the intensity there? So this information helps guiding the process. And when you collect that systematically, so this is one athlete and all the sessions that he did for about 4 months, then the coach can say, okay, this session here looks very similar to this session. So instead of doing 10 times 400, I can do a 2000, 1600, 1200, and 800, has the same kind of output. So the coach can start to decide. I don't decide. My job is to provide evidence and information so he can start driving the process. And this stuff you don't find in the literature, because there is no study that compares the difference between 3 times 500 versus 10 times 400 in your athlete. There might be a study somewhere done on a group of people, but that gives you just the information to start the process. This is the information you need to help the coach. So what do coaches need and want is high frequency assessment, which does not affect training. If you turn up to training and you're wasting 30 minutes to set something up, forget it. It's happened. It's gone. They don't like that. They want information to make day-to-day or week-to-week decision about the training content. They want a timely report. They are not going to wait 3 weeks for you to tell them what happened in that session. So what I try to do with my coaches is I do a session ends, they go home, I'm here, they receive the report of what happened in that session. So the next day they are ready to go. What's the relevant information? They want information that can help them change the program or understand what the athlete does or understand how the athlete is progressing. So if you achieve these 3 things and you make sure they don't wait weeks and you help them, you get a like. And they start to like you and they start to work with you. So what we do here is we collect a lot of data, we store data, and we organize them for reporting and review. We now have a database that's been ongoing for 3 years. You'll see a lot of that information in the conference from various people, from injury surveillance to training load. But I think the most important thing we do is we develop with the coaches what they want to see. So we don't have a closed system. We develop our own dashboards and we keep changing them. So in this particular case, this is the dashboard of the endurance team. That's the distance and HR zones report. So the coach has it on his mobile anytime, anywhere in the world, wherever he goes. So we had athletes in Portugal, they were training. The data came through the database. The coach could open his laptop in Portugal and he had all the information. That's what he sees. He wants to see in this way, and he can navigate through athlete, but also that's the session report. So every day he gets this report, and it's seamless. It's all happening. He doesn't have to do anything. Athletes are out there. And the more we do this, the more we are also understanding what the implications are for training and performance in this group. So, conclusions. Training load monitoring is important. It needs to happen, but needs to include a quantification of how the athlete is coping and perceiving the session. So what is actually happening, how the athlete is coping, how the athlete is perceiving the session. And perception session RPE is challenging in young athletes because they don't quite know how to report that. That's in our experience, but you can develop that with elite athletes. You need to know exactly what is happening in the session. So I give you an example. You get a hamstring injury, but if you don't know how fast these guys were going and how fast they normally go, how do you know if it's got to do with speed or whatever was happening? You need to know the context. Ideally, you need to know what the metabolic implications were, especially if it's middle distance runners or long runners. Was it a very heavy metabolic session? That informs nutrition, that informs recovery. I'm sorry to burst the bubble, but there is no single magic measure to drive training, and better information is necessary. So there is no magic measure. I haven't found any. I tried all the things, and there isn't a single thing that can predict anything training-wise. But if you have information, you can work together with the coach to understand better what is appropriate, what is not appropriate for that athlete. And most of all, you need years and years of data with large data sets to establish a cause-effect relationship. You know, you're not going to be able to predict injury with, we try to apply some of the most used methods. We have data of 2 years of training for the table tennis team, 7 injuries in total. You're not going to predict anything with those data, so don't even try, don't even pretend. Longitudinal observations with high frequency of measurement are necessary to individualize training approach. So you've got to be systematic in your data collection. And if you are systematic in athletics, you can use training sessions as a testing, because if you repeat the same training session periodically, that tells you how the athlete is progressing. And the coach loves it because they don't have to come to the lab. And I will conclude with the typical sentence that every scientist writes when you run out of words and you need to close your paper. You write, more studies are needed to provide better guidelines on training load monitoring and interpretation in athletics. So this is where we are. We need the community to work on that. It's not a work that somebody individually can do. And I love the idea of crowd-based data. So this is the direction we need to take. But the advice to you as individuals working with athletes, generate your own data with the athletes you work with. Read the science, read the coaching manuals, understand what the coach does, but measure things that are happening with your athletes. That's the only way to really understand more how to help them. Thank you for your attention.